My name is Roger Rempel. I'm a professional engineer with Dillon Consulting, and I have 30 years work experience as an environmental engineer. I hold a certification through Engineers Canada's Infrastructure Resilience Professional, or IRP program. I'm based at Dillon's Winnipeg office, but our team works across Canada and around the world in regions like the Arctic and countries like Vietnam, Costa Rica, USA, and others. My environmental engineering career began in impact assessment with a focus on impact modeling, and an interest in impact modeling led me to work in industrial risk assessment. That work was focused on identifying and understanding impacts as they flow through industrial processes. Most of that work was to support environmental assessment, community industrial response planning, and other regulatory processes. In the early 2000s, my impact assessment work began focusing on how changes in climate affect critical infrastructure systems and industrial processes. And at that time, climate change was starting to be explored as a driver for significant impacts and disruption in critical public infrastructure. Within a few years, Engineers Canada launched its PIBC framework, and that was simply a risk assessment process applied to critical public infrastructure for impacts from a changing climate. We completed the very first project application of PIBC in Canada back then. And since that early work, I've specialized in climate change adaptation, and a big part of my role at Dillon is to integrate climate change service all across Dillon's areas of service delivery, so across all our disciplines. In terms of what do I do and my team does in terms of the context of climate change, justice, and misinformation on climate, in my role, I oversee delivery of a range of services in climate resilience for clients in the public and the private sector. I lead a team of engineers, climatologists, and planners whose focus is 100% on climate change resilience and impact risk reduction. That's all they do. And our work in climate resilience is highly multidisciplinary. So we have experts in climate science, in meteorology, in risk assessment, in gender-based analysis, Indigenous communities, stakeholder engagement, codes and standards, and yes, even applied climate data analytics. Our approach to overcoming climate misinformation is to clearly, in plain language and figures, tell the story explicitly about the ways climate change can sneak up on the assets that you manage and the services that you provide. And this approach helps reduce climate change misinformation as we can map out how these risks are expected to flow through assets and systems. And doing this generates substantial buy-in from those responsible for these assets. And for some, it's an eye-opening experience. When you clearly lay the impact chains out, it can be a powerful moment for asset managers who had yet to really examine those climate risks before. So our work helps clients explicitly understand the many ways climate change can impact a business, a facility, if you're a producer, a crop, if you're a manufacturer, a process, or a population, and at the most macro scale, how a community may respond to those impacts. And this is a very powerful approach to combating the climate misinformation that can often foster a mindset that minimizes or disregards the disruption and costs from climate change. And so we see a lot of misunderstanding in climate change stemming from that low understanding of the costs of doing nothing. And particularly for expensive assets over a prolonged period of service life, designs intended to minimize costs typically have no climate resilience measures in place. And while that approach yields you a cheaper cost of commissioning, it's far more expensive over the intended service life of the asset to operate under that approach. So how do we contribute to climate solutions? Well, when we talk climate change, in the work we do, we are speaking ultimately about identifying and managing impacts. That's distinct from the teams of people who are working on GHG reduction. They're doing great work, but our focus is on the impacts that are coming to us and are here right now. And the deep interlinkages within systems and communities means it's important to map out how those impacts from critical systems and services roll through a community. And building that understanding allows adaptive responses tailored to reduce those risks, while also considering how distinct community populations can be affected differently by the same climate impacts. For example, we know that community impacts involve considerations such as human health. And this has high sensitivity for particularly vulnerable populations like seniors and people experiencing homelessness. An important part of our work, therefore, is to identify all the ways that different demographics can dictate how climate impacts are experienced by different citizens of the same community. And it's widely known that impacts are not balanced across different demographic categories such as gender, ethnicity, and economic status. And so our work identifies important climate impacts and how these translate to those different groups within a single community. Those inequities are real, and where in the early years of climate change resilience work, our focus was primarily on the critical infrastructure itself and the ability to deliver the essential services coming from those assets through a range of climate conditions. Today, that approach just isn't enough. Increasingly, best practice in climate risk assessment means that the scopes for these assessments now includes a focus on the impacts that extend directly and indirectly to the community. And this also contributes to climate solutions by identifying the areas where these inequities exist and building deliberate strategies to reduce them.